Thank you for coming, especially while there's a debate on at home. We appreciate you choosing us. For those of you I've not yet met, my name is Melissa Giller. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Now, I always start all of these events by recognizing the men and women around the world who defend our freedom. And for tonight's event, this sentiment couldn't be any truer. So in honor of the Marines, the sailors, the soldiers who lost their lives in Beirut, and for those who continue to fight for our freedom today, please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Before we continue, there are a few people in the audience I would just like to recognize, of course, starting, I just saw him, with Michael Reagan. Thank you for being with us today. And the President and CEO of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation Institute, David Trulio. So we have had here at the Reagan Library the honor and privilege to host Jack Carr a few times here at the Reagan Library, but in the past it was always for his thriller fiction novels, and today we're joined not only by him, but by his co-author James Scott, because they wrote their first nonfiction book together, the first in a new series on terrorism. They are here to discuss Targeted Beirut, the 1983 Marine Barracks bombing, and the untold origin story of the world on terror. A book which provides a comprehensive examination of the devastating terrorist attack on the US Marine Corps in Beirut, Lebanon, which resulted in the greatest single-day loss of life of Marines since World War II's Battle of Iwo Jima. The book examines the first attack on Marines at the US Embassy in Beirut in April of '83, and then the more catastrophic attack on Marines at their barracks in the Lebanon airport in October of '83. Now, the Reagan Library holds significant relevance for this event. President Reagan's response to the 1983 Beirut bombing underscored America's resilience and commitment to peace. His efforts to support the Lebanese people and maintain US diplomatic presence in the region are a testament to his enduring quest for stability and security. Now, I could stay up here and try and reflect on President Reagan's sentiment about those who lost their lives, or we could hear from the president himself. So let's turn to the screens and watch a few excerpts from President Reagan's remarks at a ceremony honoring the bombings of the original April 1983 bombing.
There can be no sadder duty for one who holds the office I hold than to pay tribute to Americans who've given their lives in the service of their country. Your loved ones served their country with talent and energy, courage and commitment. With your sorrow, you must feel at the same time a pride in their dedication. And we, your fellow citizens, share in that also. These gallant Americans understood the danger they faced, and yet they went willingly to Beirut. The dastardly deed, the act of unparalleled cowardice that took their lives, was an attack on all of us, on our way of life, and on the values we hold dear. We would indeed fail them if we let that act deter us from carrying on their mission of brotherhood and peace. Let us here in their presence serve notice to the cowardly, skulking barbarians in the world that they will not have their way. Let us dedicate ourselves to the cause of those loved ones, the cause they served so nobly and for which they sacrificed their lives, the cause of peace on earth and justice for all mankind. We thank God for them, and God bless you.
So to shed light on the untold stories of bravery, sacrifice, and the far-reaching implications of the 1983 terrorist attacks against the United States, let's now invite up to the stage New York Times bestselling author and former Navy SEAL Jack Carr and esteemed historian and Pulitzer Prize finalist James Scott. So we'll have you sit there.
All right, here we go. I was wondering what was going to happen with that.
I was going to block your view. That's why we put you in the middle.
I was curious.
Okay, so
Oh,
thank
God,
you.
so much emotion in that speech.
Yeah,
Gosh.
we had such a hard time getting through.
I know, you felt it just researching the book and then writing the book, then editing the book, and then in interviews leading up to book launch and interviews retelling some of those stories. It's much more emotionally draining to do that than for any of the thrillers.
Yeah, well, and we're going to get into all of that. And speaking of that, actually, my first question is specifically for you. So, you know, I've read your thriller novels. I think
you.
You've been writing them for almost a decade now, I think, right?
Closing in on it.
Yeah.
2018 was the first one.
So what made you actually decide that a nonfiction book should be your next project, and why this theme of terrorism?
Yeah, so for those who have read the novels, you know that I weave a lot of history into those novels. People who follow me on social media know that I bring up different terrorist events so that we don't forget those, try to keep the memories of those who lost their lives, keep those alive in our memories, and then try to capture some of those lessons learned. So I always knew that at some point I would transition into the nonfiction space. And I was also, from a fan perspective, very aware that Tom Clancy did that in the early 90s. So of course he starts out in 1984. Actually today is an anniversary, so in 1984, Hunt for Red October was published on October 1st by Naval Institute Press. And then so we have Hunt for Red October, we have Red Storm Rising, we have Patriot Games, we have Cardinal of the Kremlin, Clear and Present Danger, and then he branches off in the early 90s into nonfiction with Submarine, so a guided tour series on the nonfiction side and a study in command as well. So we had those two nonfictions going. So from a fan perspective, I saw that there was a model there. And when I thought I had built up enough political capital with Simon & Schuster to be able to pitch a nonfiction series, I did that. And the idea was to start a series that explored different terrorist events that impacted our foreign policy, capture those strategic, operational, tactical lessons learned, and then humanize them. Because in an event like this, you hear 241 servicemen dead, and that's a big number, but until you humanize it and learn about the people who they left behind, or what their lives were like in the wake of this tragedy, it doesn't really bring it home. And so I wanted to capture all of that, and actually that became the overriding kind of message of the book, is that the humanization of this and what happens to those guys at the tactical level that you put into harm's way. So when I did that, I wrote down about 3 pages of different terrorist events from the end of World War II up to 3 years ago when I first started discussing it with Simon & Schuster. And I kept coming back to Beirut 1983 because it was such a pivotal moment in our relationship with the Middle East. And really the rules for what has been happening ever since were set then by Iran. And we've had this model, this paradigm that we've been operating under ever since, or at least for us and the Israelis, and for the Israelis up until, I'd say, a few months ago, when they've started to shift that paradigm and change those rules. So it's a very important event to remember and capture those lessons learned, and there was no other event to start with other than Beirut 1983.
Well, we're going to get into the humanizing portion in just a little bit, because your book reads like a thriller novel because of the way you humanized it. So we're going to get to that, but I first wanted to go to James and talk about the book. So how did you two pair up? How was the research done? You were mentioning on our walk down here how you were here in the archives. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. No, so Jack reached out to me about 2 years ago, and he'd read a number of my books beforehand, and had it's actually a story that I think Jack tells better, but...
I'll do the first part. You can pick it up from there. So when I had that conversation with Simon & Schuster about wanting to do a nonfiction series, I also told them I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just me reading a bunch of books on the Middle East and terrorism, regurgitating that, and then giving some sort of analysis, but like a pop history. I didn't want that. I wanted an actual work of history with primary sources, and I wanted to work with someone who actually knew what they're doing in this space. And there was only one person I wanted to work with, James Scott, but I didn't know anything about him, which sounds strange today because there's so many ways to find out about people, but I knew nothing about him other than his work. But I should have watched a YouTube video or something, because, I mean, who knows, he might have been a total crazy person. I had no idea. But I told my publisher and agent that I want to work with this guy, and they said, okay, well, who's his agent? And I had the book right there, and we're on this call, and I look in the acknowledgments or the author's note, and I said, well, he's thanking someone named John Glussman. And my editor starts laughing, Emily Bessler, and she says, John Glussman, that's my husband.
No way.
So they connected us, and we hit it off. Luckily, you weren't a crazy person. You were as awesome as your work.
That you know of.
And not that I know of. Yeah,
Or yet.
yeah, exactly. And then that blossomed into a wonderful friendship and partnership. And luckily, but you were also contractually obligated to finish a book on World War II. So James has done 5 other books out there, 4 on World War II, 1 on the USS Liberty. Everyone should add them to their libraries for sure. And he was in the middle of this one, though, on the 3 days between Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so contractually obligated to finish that. But luckily, my editor and publisher is married to your editor. And so he very wisely deferred to her. So, and off we went to the races.
But he did actually give me a piece of advice when all this was going down, and it was during the pandemic, kind of the tail end, so they were both working at home, and so I was on the phone call with John. He's like, let me step outside so we can have this conversation where my wife doesn't hear this, and he says, James, whatever you do, don't screw this up. So no, as Jack said, they graciously gave me a deferment on my contract so I could work on this. And I'll be honest, like when Jack Carr calls you up and says, I want to work on a project with you, you pretty much jump. I mean, that's such an awesome opportunity. I'd watched the Terminal List, the show. I'd even got my wife to watch it, and she doesn't even like stuff that's military related very often. And then I started reading the books, and it was almost serendipitous that during this process, as I'd gotten to know your work, you reached out to me. And so, and we were also really lucky as well, because when we first started talking about the idea of Beirut, I mean, as Jack noted, I mean, it really is this pivotal period. And, we can look back on that now, and we can see that, because, in the 1980s, we're beginning to sort of move away from the Cold War. I mean, that's kind of the fulcrum of our experience on our foreign policy is we're shifting as the Cold War is going to wind down, our experience in the Middle East is going to sort of ramp up, and that's going to be where we spend, of course, the next 4 decades of fighting and whatnot. And so, but as Jack noted, it all really traces back to Beirut. And so that was really the logical beginning point for this. And so literally when he reached out to me, I happened to be at a conference that weekend, a World War II conference, and one of the other panelists there is a friend of mine. He'd been the former director of Marine Corps history. And so I mentioned to him, I said, Charlie, I've been approached about this project on Beirut. I said, what do you guys have in the Marine archives that are related to that? And he said, oh, we've got everything. He says, we've got, the monthly command chronologies, we've got the weekly sit reps, we've got the daily message traffic. He said, we even did a whole series of oral histories with guys right after the bombing happened. And just so happened, a buddy of mine from the Citadel I'd gone to school with, I was literally come back to that same conference. I remember he had mentioned at some point some connection to Beirut. I texted him, I said, Mark, didn't you have some involvement in Beirut, or didn't you know some people? And he texted me back, and he's like, man, I was one of the rescuers there. And so I called him as I'm running between gates, and I said, explain to me this. And he walked me through his story, and he's like, I can put you guys in touch with everybody. And so it was like, Jack and I were seeing all green lights. The archival work was there, the ability to get access to the survivors, their families, and things like that were there. I mean, it was just green light, green light, green light for us to jump on this project. So.
Yeah, and there wasn't really the seminal work on it yet also. When I was looking at it, there was one book written back in 1984, so essentially as a current events book back then. Then Colonel Garrity writes one about a decade ago or so, over a decade ago. But there wasn't really that book. If you'd asked me, what should I read on Beirut 1983, there wasn't really that one book you could point to, that one documentary, or even a movie that you could point to. So there was opportunity there as well.
Well, and I found the book to be a really great mixture of history and what happened, but all the letters, that was what was crazy to me. How did you get your hands on all of these letters that these soldiers and Marines were writing home to their parents that they were still kept, they could quote the letter, word for word? Where did you get your hands on all that?
So, we did over 100 hours of interviews with survivors, and that's the guys that were there. It's also the widows, it's the children, it's even the parents in some cases when they're still alive. But when you're talking to somebody 40 years later, they're looking at it through the lens of a 65-year-old reflecting on what it was like to be 20 at that time period. And so as a historian, you're always looking for those contemporaneous documents that really capture that moment. What was the feeling like, the experience like for a young 18, 19, 20-year-old and caught up in the middle of this Lebanese civil war and, of course, this terrorist attack. And so we were able to get over 1,000 pages of letters and diaries from folks who were there. And, of course, every time I call, I'm always like, what do you have in the way of letters? What do you have in the way of diaries and things like that? And the word spread. That Jack and I were talking to folks. We wanted to hear from people and whatnot. And so, no sooner did we talk to somebody than, you'd get a text message, talk to my buddy so-and-so, he's waiting on your call. And then, word spread. They're looking for diaries. They're looking for letters. We were at the 40th anniversary last year. Jack did the keynote speech there, and we literally had draft of the manuscript done at that point. Afterwards, all these guys came up and they're like, I want to be interviewed. I've got my letters. I've got my diary. So here we were back to the races, just kind of trying to shoehorn more information back into the book because, we really wanted to get as many of those personal stories from the men who were there into this book as possible. I mean, this is their story. It's not ours. It's their story. And
so we're going to dive into the book, but I want to give a quick shout out into It's All Their Stories. Thanks to these two gentlemen, our Veterans Day speaker is one of the survivors of the Beirut attack. So come back on November 11th.
Well, I remember also one of the first letters that you sent me that I read. It was just heartbreaking to read it because the person didn't make it, and the letter arrived home. I think afterwards, parents get it after. But there's a Polaroid attached to it, and it's a guy standing in front of a Jeep. And I remember I remember the Time and Newsweek covers when I was a kid, being on the kitchen table. I remember this event very distinctly, being so young and already knowing that I was going into the military. Anything that had anything to do with the military, I was on it. And I remember I looked at this photo and I thought, oh my, if I'd seen this photo at age 9, 10, I would have thought, oh my gosh, look how old this guy is. And then now I'm looking at this photo and I'm thinking just how young this guy was. It was just such a visual reminder of how young these guys were and how young the people are who we put out there on the front lines, and how those people, those 18, 19, 20-year-old kids are the final decision makers in a chain of decision makers that starts with the President of the United States and then filters down to some kid who's out there manning a checkpoint somewhere around the world, holding a rifle, off safe, finger on trigger, wondering if this vehicle it's approaching is laden with explosives or it just has bad suspension. And then he'll be the final decision maker in that chain.
Wow. So let's actually get into the book, and let's start at the beginning. So obviously your book really focuses on the October attack, but it starts as it should in the April attack. What did that first bombing sort of teach us, if anything, about the war on terror?
Yeah, I mean, it unfortunately, it didn't teach us a whole lot. And in part because at that time, and just to sort of set the stage for what was going on in Beirut at that point, it was a mess. There were, car bombs every day in Beirut at that time. Of course, it's coming out of the middle of, it's still really involved in the civil war. You've got the Christians, the Sunnis, the Shias, the Druze. You got the Israelis who are there. Of course, you've got the Syrians who are trying to sort of carve off a chunk of Lebanon. And of course, into this mix come the Iranians, who send 800 Iranian Revolutionary Guards into there to sort of try to capitalize on the chaos and spread their revolution. So it's just an absolute mess at that point. And so car bombs are pretty much a everyday part of life. I mean, in fact, there was a guy whose job it was to go around the city and defuse car bombs. I mean, he only had 8 fingers, which was a occupational hazard. But anyway, he had really good work. But most car bombs at that point were static. They were left on the street corner and they were remotely detonated. And so the embassy bombing was the first in which somebody involved a suicide attacker who literally drove into the building there. But it really confounded the Americans and of course the Lebanese. In fact, they really kind of were telling us, this is kind of a one-off, but it's different, yes, but then again, we live in the car bomb capital of the world. And so it didn't really, it didn't stand out as much as we can look back now and say it should have, but it really didn't, because of course at that point, it's one bomb in a city where these things go off every single week. And
I think it's more what they learned, what the enemy learned, rather than what we learned from it. So I look at it as kind of like the jab before the reverse comes, like you're feeling out your opponent if you're a boxer in here, and that's kind of the jab to set something up, and maybe a couple more throughout that summer and into that fall, and they get a couple more jabs in, and then they land that cross in October.
Well, and speaking of the jabs, you have your different chapters and the various dates as they're leading into the October bombing, and one of your dates was September 11th. It wasn't lost on me.
Yeah.
So that's pretty crazy.
There's another September 11th connection. You want to tell that one?
Which
when in the congressional hearings?
Yeah, so actually to your point, that's a really good one. To your point on like what did we learn or whatnot, it's not really until after the Marine bombing that we really kind of connect the dots and sort of figure out that, hey, this is a new form of warfare. And actually, it really crystallizes in the fall of 1983 when Marine Corps Commandant General P.X. Kelly is testifying before Congress. And of course, throughout this testimony, he's being asked, well, how is the Marine security and things of that nature? And he's getting frustrated because he's telling these lawmakers, he says, you're missing the point. You're looking at the forest for the trees here. This isn't about security and whatnot. This is a new form of warfare that we're facing. And we need to wake up and realize that this is a new war. And he continues to get flustered and whatnot, and he finally breaks down and he says, what is it going to take? a suicide bomber, and an airplane for everybody to wake up to this? And of course, 18 years later, that's exactly the lesson that we would learn. But it was, when we ran across that, I mean, it was so haunting to find that because it literally foreshadowed, where this was headed.
That's incredible. I'm a little speechless. That's incredible. So as we're moving toward the October terrorist attack, U.S. Marines are sent on a peacekeeping mission. And there's a lot in your book that really goes into detail about that. But then they are sort of switched from a peacekeeping mission more into joining in the fight. And I know I'm skipping around, but I want people to read the book. So sort of, can you talk about what made that change?
I'll set it up real quick. So as someone that's fairly in tune with different terrorist events, I try to be a student of warfare. Always a student of anything that I'm doing, but from my earliest days, a student of warfare, very interested in insurgencies and counterinsurgencies and special operations. And for some reason, at that early age, I always knew that my generation's war would have some connection to terrorism. So I'm studying all of those, anything I can possibly find on that. But so I was very aware of the embassy bombing, very aware of the headquarters and barracks bombing, but I wasn't that aware of what happened between those two events. And of course, we're losing servicemen during that time as well, and wounded during that same time. There were peacekeeping and peacekeepers was the word of the day, of course, trying to maintain that neutrality in there, and which of course became impossible. What happened is that the Marines, being the symbol of American might, become that target. So,
yeah, and I'll just add, we increasingly get sort of pulled into this domestic conflict because at its heart, it's a civil war that's taking place in Lebanon, and it's been going on since the 1970s with intermittent breaks and things like that, and so the U.S. goes there in an effort to help get the PLO out. And to sort of broker a peace deal and to sort of create some stability so that the nationalist government can sort of then stand on its feet. And what happens is, unfortunately, is we get there, and of course it's this what we hope is going to be a quick in and out, sort of gets that mission creep, and it gets drawn out and extended and whatnot, and the Marines are gradually pulled in from the sidelines of this fight to being on the playing field of it. And of course, with that comes the bullseye that lands on their back.
Well, and speaking of the bullseye and the jabs, your book leads up, and then we get to October 23, 1983. Can you share with the audience, for those who may not know or may not know all the details, because your book really goes into details, what happened on that day?
yeah, well, it's a Sunday, which also tells us that the enemy's been watching us, because that's a day of rest, a little different than the other days. The Marines typically slept in a little bit. The rules were a little relaxed on those Sundays. So Sunday morning is when they plan this, and you hear about what happens, and you hear about a truck blasting by everybody and detonating and taking down this building. So I was aware of all that, but when you hear it from someone who saw it or who felt it and then stood back up and looked at where a building was supposed to be, that it was no longer there, that's what really brings it home to me. And some of these stories, you can also listen to, we interviewed a few people on the podcast, so you can listen to some of this in their own words and hear it straight from them. And in one great story is a guy supposed to be in that building in the basement developing film, and he's walking across to go do his job, and he thinks, it's Sunday, I'm gonna go get a cup of coffee. So he turns around, goes to get a cup of coffee, and the bomb goes off, and then he's one of the first responders to this.
And he's also going to be your
He's our
guest
Veterans Day speaker.
for Veterans Day. Randy
you can hear his
Great
story
guy.
from him directly.
Great guy.
It's so powerful. And another one, there's Don Howell, who goes to sleep in the basement because they have these alerts that would go off if there was an imminent attack, and they'd have to go to the basement, essentially a bomb shelter, to take cover, and then an all clear would sound, and they could go back to their rooms. And he's on the fourth deck, I believe, so he decides to stay down there in the basement. And then the building comes down on top of him. And he kind of comes to his senses, and there's someone next to him who wasn't there a minute before, and he asks them, like, who are you, and kind of, what are you doing here, and where were you a second ago? And he says he was sleeping on the fourth deck, and now he's right here. And so they're in complete pitch blackness. Imagine all the dust and everything in the air from an event like this. And he closes his eyes, says a prayer, opens them, and there's a tiny shaft of light, and he starts clawing his way out. And then we have
Such a
Danny
powerful
Wheeler.
story.
Yeah, Danny Wheeler.
I'll tell about Danny, but it's just to even back up a touch, just to let folks know. I mean, this entire terrorist attack took 10 seconds. That's it. A truck, a Mercedes truck, loaded down with 12,000 pounds of explosives, busts through our security, makes it into the lobby of this building, and it's built like an embassy suite, so it's got a sort of an atrium in the middle that's sort of open with balconies all the way around, and so the driver is able to penetrate inside. When the bomb goes off, it is the largest non-nuclear explosion the FBI has ever seen. It literally brings down this entire concrete and steel rebar building into just a pile of rubble in a matter of seconds. Most of the survivors inside never even heard the blast. They literally woke up, they went to bed at night, and they woke up buried under rubble. And one of the ones that we interviewed, whose story just affects me so much every time I hear it, is a guy by the name of Danny Wheeler. And he was the Protestant chaplain, and he lived on the 4th floor. And he went to bed that night and had said his prayers, woke up that morning literally underground. The 2 walls had sort of collapsed to create an A-frame that shielded him. And on one of those walls is where all the previous chaplains had written a prayer before they left Beirut. And Danny called it the blessing wall. And so he wakes up saved literally by this blessing wall, but of course at this point he's buried underground. And if you can imagine the scene, it's pitch black dark. It's really hard to breathe because it's all this pulverized concrete. There are fires burning underground, and of course there's all the fumes and stuff from the explosion as well. And so he waits, and he starts, in order to pass the time, he starts reliving and going over through his head of the plots of Louis L'Amour novels that he had read, that his wife had sent him. Because in Louis L'Amour novels, there's always a cave-in, and somebody's got to dig their way out. And so he does that. 1 hour turns to 2, and then 3, and nobody comes for him. And he's still buried. And at that point, he's the chaplain. He's got 3 children, ages 7, 5, and 3. And he starts having this conversation with God. And he gets very, very angry at this point. And he says, God, is this what you meant to do? Did you bring me here to kill me? What's going to happen to my family, to my wife and my kids? At that point, God says to him, he says, don't worry, I've got this. And soon thereafter, a hand comes through the rubble and grabs his hand. And he holds on to it, he won't let go. And at that point, they begin in the process of digging him out. And he is the last soul that God delivered alive from that wreckage that day. Spent over 5 hours buried underneath that building. And just an amazing individual, an amazing story. I mean, I get goosebumps right now just retelling that story. So.
Well, and the rabbi was a great story, too.
Yeah, and it's, of course, in the Rabbi Reznikov. He's the reason that they knew where Danny was is because he had his Advent stole, which is a purple scarf-like vestment, and it was in the rubble, and the wind was blowing, and it was waving, and it took one of the guys said, "What is this purple cloth?" And the rabbi heard it and said, purple is a very alien color in a desert landscape. And he immediately recognized it for what it was, and he said, dig here. And sure enough, it led straight down to the chaplain. So amazing stories. But there's so many of those kinds of stories, as Jack was just saying with Don and with Randy and with Danny. I mean, there's so many of these stories. And so you have to read the book to get all of them.
You do.
So.
Well, and the last one I'll bring up, and I really wish I could remember his name, and I don't, but the other one that really got me was one of the ones who didn't survive, because you're also telling the stories of all of those who are home, who are waiting by the phone, and every time the phone rings and every time the door knocks, are they being told that their loved one has died? And there was one, and I'm so sorry I can't remember
Probably
his name.
Dr. John Hudson?
The one who's...
Dr. John Hudson.
So if you want to tell that was incredible.
Yeah, so he really becomes the emotional heart of this whole story. And before I say what he did in the military, how many people in here served in the military? Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you. And now we have firefighters and EMTs and police officers in here too? Yeah?
Nice.
Awesome. Nice. And Tim Abel up front, everybody, I have to just point out and say thank you for being here tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time in uniform and leading the way afterward. Mm-hmm. So for those who are in the military, you know that that the medical corps is kind of a different breed. Like they might not wear the uniforms quite right, and that's okay. You just want them to be a good doctor or do a good root canal or whatever they're supposed to be doing. So they go to a different kind of a school where they kind of learn to put the stuff on kind of right. And that's who we have. We have Dr. John Hudson, and it was 600 pages of letters that we ended up
9 hours of recording.
9 hours of recordings, but he's kind of like the Hawkeye of the group, and there's no incentive for him to toe any lines or anything like that because he's going to do his time and get out. And he had this premonition, it seems, that something was going to happen, and he got these two dentists up to speed on triage and mass casualty events, and put them through a little training on, hey, if something happens, this is what we're gonna do, kind of outside the normal realm of training. But he left behind a wonderful wife who helped us with all this, and son Will, who is just an incredible human being. Went to 2 of our events on this tour. Who was 9 months old, so he never knew his father. And of course, that's not a story unique to them. That happens. All of our wars have sons that grow up without fathers and with empty seats at that dinner table. So, but that one. Maybe you tell the part how he's...
Yeah, so, he, Dr. Hudson, of course, as Jack noted, we just benefited so tremendously from the paper trail he left behind, and so we were able to sort of bring back his story. And so when they found him a couple days later, one of his good friends, who's a Navy dentist, had insisted that he be the one to identify him. And so when they found him, he was there, and he had his hand on his head like that. And so anyway, after they get back from Beirut, the dentist, a guy by the name of Dr. Jimmy Ware, goes to visit Lisa Hudson. And like a lot of families at that point, they're really wrestling with grief and understanding. And maybe there's a clerical error, maybe he survived, maybe he's in a hospital. They don't know. And it falls to Jimmy Ware to be the one to say, no, I'm the one that identified John Hudson. And so she asked him, how was he when you found him? And he described the scene, including the fact that his hand was that way. And she got up and she ran out of the room, and he thought, oh my God, I must have upset her or whatnot, terribly. She comes back in with a photograph, and she said, did he look like this? And it was a picture of John sleeping with his hand like that. And he said, that's exactly what he looked like. And it was through that story that she knew that he had died in his sleep. He'd never heard the bomb go off. He'd never suffered, suffocated, or anything like that his death had been instantaneous. And so he was able to provide that comfort to that family. And it is such a powerful story. Lisa's such an amazing woman. Her son Will is just terrific. And it's, as Jack noted earlier, we really couldn't have done this book without that phenomenal cooperation from the Lisa Hudsons, the Will Hudsons, the Randy Gattos. We wanted to get, it's their story. We wanted to get as many of their voices in here and to tell those stories as possible.
It seemed like they were ready also to tell their story at this point. A lot of them thought that the Marine Corps moved on fairly quickly. In the aftermath of this event, it was a very dark day for the Marine Corps. It wasn't raising the flag on Iwo Jima, and a lot of them, I think it bonded them together. I don't know if it was that way right out of the gate, but certainly all these years later, it's bonded them together, because it wasn't very many Marines that served there, or service members in general who served there. It wasn't World War II that affected a generation. It wasn't Vietnam that affected you, whether you went downrange or just watched it on the news, or understood that there was this civil upheaval in our streets and college campuses. It was a very small number of people that were there over these the couple of years that we were there. So I think it's bonded them together because they had such a unique experience there. And then the Marine Corps, they felt like, generally speaking, but I think it's almost to a man, felt that the Marine Corps kind of left them behind after this. And at this point, they were ready to tell this story. And it was such an honor to be trusted with these stories. So that was a heavy weight, because in the thrillers, if I make a mistake, not that I ever have, if I ever did, I could say it's fiction. You have that to fall back on. But in something like this, you don't have that luxury. And at the same time, you also want to make sure you get this right, because there are so many people who lost loved ones. There are so many people who are still living in October of 1983, even to this day. There are those that have moved on, but when you bring them back to tell that story, you realize that they're still dealing with the emotional and in some cases physical trauma of that day. So it's a heavy responsibility that we took very seriously, and from the get-go, we wanted to be as thoughtful and respectful as we possibly could doing this, and doing it right, that's why James was just so amazing, knowing how to do all this stuff and how to annotate everything correctly in the back with all these notes and the photographs and everything else. So it was a responsibility that weighed a lot more heavy on me than the thrillers, certainly.
Well, I can tell you as a reader of the book, you guys did an amazing job bringing their stories to life. So kudos to the two of you. So back to October 23rd, right? It happened because, well, it happened for many reasons, but they were sort of unprotected in a way in this airport like an embassy suites. Hindsight's stupid at this point, but is there anything they could have done differently, do you think? Do the Marines think that might have protected them better?
Yeah, I'll jump on that. Yeah, the challenge that they had at this point is that the situation is changing so rapidly on the ground there that their rules of engagement and their mission, the orders that they were receiving weren't keeping up fast enough. And so Colonel Garrity had this great line. He said, the mission changed, but no one changed the mission. And so they were still operating on the idea that they're peacekeepers. And if you're there as a peacekeeper and you're there to show the flag, you can't be doing that in a bunker mentality type setting where it's dragon's teeth and it's sandbags and everything like that. And so they were really trying to balance the need for safety from the artillery and the mortar rounds and things of that nature with their mission, which was show the flag and be seen and provide a stabilizing force. And so that was kind of the challenge that they faced. And I think there was a real disconnect between things were moving so fast on the ground in Beirut that a lot of the policymakers in Washington weren't able to keep up with how fast it changed. Because I mean, from May when they first arrive, they're out building playground equipment for Lebanese kids. The dentists are doing dental work at orphanages and things like that. To literally September, they're suddenly having to hunker down underground and they're being shot by snipers. As anybody who's ever dealt with bureaucracy knows, it takes a while it's like turning a ship to sort of come to that realization. And so events were moving really quite quickly for them. So, in hindsight's always 2020, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but also we were talking, it sounds like, this is a terribly dark day for the Marine Corps and for the country. Very pivotal, obviously, with our relationship with the Middle East, with Iran, with its proxies. Lessons learned by the enemy really outweigh the lessons that we learned that day. But in the aftermath of this event, something that really stood out to me is something that also happened at Abbey Gate, and there's obviously a lot of things that went wrong at Abbey Gate as we leave Afghanistan, but that same U.S. service member that's blown off their feet or hears the explosion from across the airfield or across the compound gets up, and in both cases, in Beirut 1983 and in Afghanistan in August of 2021, and they run to the sound of that explosion. And they try to save as many of their fellow brothers in arms in the case of Beirut and brothers and sisters in arms in the case of Abbey Gate in Afghanistan as they possibly can. And also in Afghanistan, as many innocent Afghan civilians as they possibly can. While in both cases, other people are holding security because they didn't know if it was going to be the first with follow-on attacks, or they just weren't sure. But it's that same U.S. serviceman who's fighting for the person to the right, person to the left. That's that same person, has that spirit that gets up and runs to the sound of the explosion, runs to the sound of the guns. And tonight we have firefighters and you have law enforcement out there, first responders that are essentially doing that same thing around the country. But that's an American spirit that really stood out to me in both of those cases, and gives me hope in what's a very dark story.
I love that. So the attack happens, and President Reagan actually gives remarks to the families of the deceased, and we're going to watch, you might not be able to see it, it's behind you, we're going to watch a quick clip of that.
I came here today to honor so many who did their duty and gave that last full measure of their devotion. They kept faith with us and our way of life. We wouldn't be free long but for the dedication of such individuals. They were heroes, and we're grateful to have had them with us. The motto of the United States Marine Corps, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. Well, the rest of us must remain always faithful to those ideals which so many have given their lives to protect. Our heritage of liberty must be preserved and passed on. Let no terrorist question our will, or no tyrant doubt our resolve. Americans have courage and determination, and we must not and will not be intimidated by anyone, anywhere.
Now, you talk about this day in this speech in your book. Can you share some of the sentiments?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that stood out to me generally in this is what a big heart that Ronald Reagan had. That part really stood out to me. You can tell just from the speeches, especially the first one that we heard there, just how much emotion is in that voice, and going to the White House Correspondents' Dinner and not delivering the remarks, saying, I'll save that speech for next year. You really got the sense that he had such a huge heart. And Michael Reagan, thank you so much for your support during all of this, and your friendship over the last few years. Getting to know you has been amazing. And Michael shared something with me that ended up in the book as well, in that this event really haunted his father till the day that he died.
Yeah, and I'll add one thing too there. Actually, Reagan at the end, after the Marines leave Lebanon, he actually writes down his notes and his thoughts on it all, and that he then hands it over that it could eventually be used in a speech, but it never really was. And it really, in a lot of ways, was an anguished plea to the Marines. He says, you know, you were sent in on an impossible mission, and the inability of America to achieve its goals there was not your fault. You were up against forces, I'm paraphrasing here, up against forces that were greater than anything any of us could have imagined. And so anyway, it was that Jack actually had that in his speech last year to the 40th anniversary of the Beirut veterans, an excerpt from it. And so many of those guys came up afterwards like, can we get copies of that? And we shared it with them, because it really was, as Jack was saying, I mean, Reagan had such a huge heart here. And you see it in his diary entries, you see it in you know, his remarks there that were never shared beforehand. It was real anguish, you know, for these guys and these families. And he met with them there. That was November 4th, Camp Lejeune. He met privately afterwards with a lot of the families there, hugged a lot of them. Nancy did as well. I mean, just a tremendous heart. So.
And that when even just reading that speech that night was hard to get through, and it was the first time that it had been uttered aloud, because it was written down in the diary and never really used. So reading it was hard to just get through it, even all those years later, because there's so much emotion in the words. So that was even hard to say out loud that night.
Now, my next question you actually may not be able to answer, because I don't think you covered it in your book, but I was curious. We learned so much from 9/11 that those who went in, the firefighters, the first responders, to do the recovery, years later perhaps died of cancer or other things from all of that concrete and dust that they had inhaled. And I was curious if you, in any of your interactions with family members, there was such destruction in October, that same must have happened.
Yeah, we've heard anecdotally of guys with respiratory issues and things like that. I mean, you're inhaling just massive amounts of concrete dust. It's very similar. I mean, the guys, when you see the images of 9/11 and people walking through the streets and they're completely caked in dust, it was the exact same scenario in Lebanon at that time period. And of course, these guys were caked in that dust, buried underneath it, then had to dig through it all. But there was no study done afterwards. There was no real scientific analysis. It's just anecdotal stuff that we've heard from guys like, you know, I'm dealing with the VA right now. I've got respiratory issues, and I think it has to do with my exposure there. So that's the extent that we've heard of it.
There wasn't really that lobbying element. There's Beirut Veterans of America now that's stronger as more people realize the importance of what they were involved in, and so but there wasn't really a lobbying group for these guys. The Marine Corps didn't focus on it. The VA didn't really focus on it. It wasn't Agent Orange from Vietnam, and it wasn't some of these things like burn pits that we have today with all this awareness. There was no social media to get it out there, so you didn't have journalists really focusing on this to bring awareness to the issue, because it was such a small number of guys. So, but they would have to be dealing with a lot of after effects of that day, certainly.
So I have a handful more questions, but I'll pare them down because I want to make sure we have time to go to all of you. So start thinking of your questions. I'm going to ask one more, and then we're going to go out to the audience. You know, with your history in the military, with all the research the two of you have done, I know you're doing other books on terrorism, so you probably have a series. Are you worried about the next Beirut? Does that keep you up at night?
Yeah, because we're not very good in this country about learning from the lessons of history and then applying those lessons to present problem sets as wisdom. For some reason, we neglect to do that. After 9/11, we talked about some of those lessons learned, but in the direct aftermath, in the few months following 9/11, we had a Soviet experience from 1979 to 1989 that we could have looked to, and if we did look to that, we drew some of the wrong lessons, if we drew any lessons at all. I tend to think that imperial hubris tends to creep in when the United States is dealing with foreign adversaries for whatever reason. but we're not very good at doing that. And that was one of the main reasons I wanted to write this book and do this series, to capture them, because it's the least that I can do as an author, is at least capture them. I don't know if a future president of the United States or Joint Chiefs of Staff or anyone in this bureaucracy that continues to grow at the federal level will read it, but at least it's there. And we've captured these lessons. And of course, the enemy's always adapting to us. We're always adapting to that enemy, trying to anticipate what the other is going to do next. But we're not very good at that at all. So we didn't even have to, in the case of Afghanistan, we didn't have to go back to 3 British incursions. We didn't have to go back to Alexander the Great. I mean, it was right there, 79 to 89. And so the hope is that we think long and hard at the senior levels of government, and the presidents surround themselves with advisors that can really hash things out, and that understand that understanding the nature of the conflict in which we're about to commit U.S. forces, or in which U.S. forces are committed, they need to understand that the nature of those conflicts before they put boots on the ground, and realize that there will be multi-generational impacts at the tactical level to their strategic level decisions. So you owe it to those family members, not just the guys you're putting out there at the checkpoints, but their family members as well, to really think these things through before you put U.S. boots on the ground.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so we are going to go out to all of you. Please raise your hand. Because we are recording this, it's important that you only ask a question if one of our team members actually brings the microphone to you. So does no one be shy? We have questions. I don't know where Elaine, all the way up front.
Well, I think your being here is rather interesting because of what's going on today. I think my question and a frustration is, it alludes to what you were just talking about. I don't think we understand the culture, the thinking of the terrorists. They don't want peace. I think that diplomacy is futile with these people. And listening today to what the spokesman from the Pentagon said was, of course, they want diplomacy. They think that's going to bring security and stability to the region. I happen to be very cynical about that. I was just wondering what you might think about something like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a stark difference between us and terrorists or proxy elements of other countries that are using those proxy forces as terrorists. And for us, everyone in this room, we put ourselves between an enemy and civilians. And terrorist proxy forces, people with different values, do the exact opposite. They put civilians between themselves and the enemy. And I think that's a very clear way to look at the differences between some of these cultures and some of these different organizations that may be out there. And in that part of the world, as horrible as it is to say, there was an acceptable level of violence for the last couple of decades over there. And that paradigm has now started to shift. But certainly having a strong country over there, military, intelligence, putting fear in the hearts of your enemy, keeping them looking over their shoulders like Israel has started to do from essentially midsummer on, that is really how to keep the peace in that part of the world. It's through strength.
Yeah, and I'll add one thing. I mean, it's moving so fast over there. I mean, Jack and I wrote this op-ed that in every day it gets held, we have to rewrite the top of it with the latest breaking news. And it's poor David Brown, our publicist there, has to keep going round and round with the media outlets on it, because it's just, I mean, it is, as Jack noted, the paradigm has shifted and we're kind of off the map. Things are changing so quickly there right now that, every day I wake up and check the news to see, where are we today with it.
Yeah, 3 years ago when I first talked to Simon & Schuster about this, I didn't realize just how current it was going to be today. I mean, the seeds of what's happening today were planted back in the early 1980s in Lebanon.
That said, I do think it's David with Simon & Schuster does say that, they do keep the IDF on standby with Simon & Schuster for publicity purposes. To help out and make things topical. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to hold back.
Yeah.
There's a question right here.
I was just wondering you guys had an opportunity to talk to any of the people that came in off the ships that were in the harbor on the search and rescue and ultimately the recovery teams.
Yeah, we talked a lot, yeah, because there were, what the gentleman's referring to is there was, the Marines, when they travel with a number of ships there, and they have medical personnel and people like that on board. And a lot of those folks came in by helicopter that day to help out, to dig through the rubble pile, things like that. Of course, the first responders, as they're sort of pulling these guys out, the main idea of what these dentists were doing was to stabilize them, then get them back aboard the Iwo Jima, and which is a helicopter landing ship for the Marines. There they set up in the hangar bay, sort of an emergency medical center. There they further stabilized guys. They had an operating room there if necessary, and then they were able to bring them back for medevac flights out that day. So I mean, the bombing takes place at 6:21 that morning. They're literally taken out to the Iwo Jima, they're stabilized, they're brought back in, and literally starting that afternoon all the way up through the early evening, these wounded folks are being put onto planes and flown out to Italy, to Germany, and to Cyprus. So, I mean, as Jack noted earlier, it's an incredible rescue story. And the logistics involved in sort of bringing all these different folks together and services together to be able to get these guys out and get them, to proper hospital care was really one more example of just how incredible that was.
Erica, back there.
First, I would like to say that my wife and I are huge fans of yours, and we're just thrilled to be able to see you in person. Now my question, tying into your historical analysis of 1983, have I correctly heard that the very recently deceased Hassan Nasrallah was involved in that event?
I don't know if he was involved in the event, but he was involved in Hezbollah back then. We had two different terrorist organizations that at this time are morphing into what we know today as Hezbollah. So, that's where he got his start. I think before that he'd gone to Iraq. He'd gone there to study Islam. He'd gone back to Iran at some point to study as well. But at this point he's a member of Hezbollah. But was he involved in this? There were other people that have been taken off the map recently who were directly involved in this. And one of the first ones was killed back in 2008 in Damascus, Syria, and was probably a joint U.S. intelligence and Israeli intelligence type of operation. And we talk about that near the end of the book. But the Israelis get very creative with how they do these things, as we saw recently with the pager operation and the handheld communications device operation, which people will be studying for decades, if not centuries to come. A modern day Trojan horse using technical devices of convenience to put fear into the hearts of your enemy. And so they get creative out there. So there have been others now in the past couple months, two in particular, that have been taken off since the end of July until more recently who were involved in the planning of this.
There's a couple questions up here, Stephanie, in the front row.
Yes, you talked about the role of bureaucracy and how the situation on the ground was changing, but that the ship was kind of hard to swing around. I'm wondering, has the sort of military bureaucracy at the top echelons gotten worse, gotten better over time, and what can be done to
I'll take this.
improve the situation and also eliminate some of the distractions to what the mission needs to be?
So I heard the question there, and I'd say that it's interesting because we do have accountability. Someone steps up and takes responsibility for this, and as soon as it happens, Colonel Garrity knows that he's going to be the one that essentially takes the fall for this. Nobody above him really will. It's going to fall on his shoulders, and he knew that. He was a recruiting poster Marine, and probably would have been commandant of the Marine Corps had this not happened. He's an amazing guy, by the way, and he pivots. He's also a great example of getting knocked down and continuing to move forward, getting back up and moving forward. He was on track to be the commandant, essentially. This happens and derails that career, but he dusts himself off, gets back up, and moves forward in another line of work, but related in the intelligence field, but just an amazing guy. But there was someone who was held accountable, and that was him. But he was put in that position by people above him in the chain of command, just similar to what we saw at Abbey Gate. We had Bagram, we put people in a tactically disadvantageous, untenable position, and a similar thing happened here. Difference being, now, all these years later, no one is held accountable. 0 people above a certain rank essentially continued on their paths or were promoted or moved on and sat on boards of different companies in the defense space. So that's a stark difference. So with looking at those 2 examples, I would say things have gotten worse, though there's probably a better word than worse. I would just say there's been a lack of accountability really from the end of World War II, 1947 certainly, with the reorganization of our military and intelligence services, and we didn't see that up through World War II. General George Marshall, he held people accountable. If you didn't do the job, you were out and someone was put in place to see if they could do it. And that's how we got to all the names that we all know in this room that led us to victory in World War II. It took Lincoln a lot of generals till he got to Grant. And then after 1947, for whatever reason, we start to see that kind of go by the wayside. And we see as people, it's like we say, it's the profession of arms, it's not the career of arms. And for something shifts there in 1947, I think, and it becomes more of a career for a lot of people. And so you get these people who just stay in and get up to the top, not because they're the best and the brightest, but simply because they didn't do things wrong along the way, which might not be the best people to put in place. Yeah.
So we have time for just one more question.
We got one in the front right here.
So we got to take the one in the front. Hold on, the microphone's coming to you. Hold on one second.
Great to have you both here.
Yeah, thank you.
And to sit next to a man who reads your books.
Yeah, there's Ray Porter right here in the front, everybody who listens to the books.
Right.
All right, Ray. Yeah. Nice.
I read the books, but they sound so much better.
They do. This is true. This is true.
Thinking about your question, Lieutenant Colonel David Hackworth was a friend of mine, which you know.
Yep.
Wrote a great book called About Face, about Vietnam. And back in those days, he was on 60 Minutes. And the world was being told by Washington we were winning the war in Vietnam. And he did 60 Minutes, and they asked him if we were winning. And he said, as long as we allowed the perfume princesses in Washington sitting in high chairs to run the war, we will lose it. They need to give it back to those of us on the ground. I think that's what you were just saying.
I think that is much better said than I could have done it. Or maybe he was just looking as a way to move on from military service with a.
Well, he basically did.
Yeah, but
He went to Australia. He wrote a book called About Face.
Yes.
And came back to cover the 2 wars, Middle East wars after that, and died of cancer not too many years ago.
Yeah.
But one of the most decorated soldier in history of combat, Lieutenant Colonel David Hackworth. Look him up.
Yep.
He's great.
Yep, true soldier. Yep. Michael Reagan, everybody.
Well, with that, right on time, I want to thank the 2 of you, actually, not just for coming, but for writing this book.
Absolutely.
Truly, I recommend everyone who hasn't purchased one to please go to our store and buy one. Come up to the store. They will be sitting there. They will sign them for you.
Actually, before we move on, I got one thing to say at the end. So one thing before everybody takes off and we go, I think we're doing a little photo or something like that, maybe, I don't know.
Sure.
But whatever we do next, just before we move on and go our separate ways. First, I want to thank everybody for being here. Really appreciate you guys taking the time tonight. It means a ton to us. And then I also just want to say something about those 18, 19, 20-year-old service men and women who are out there that I talked about earlier that are standing those checkpoints around the world, because right now the sun's going down here and it's coming up somewhere else around the world, and there's that same 18, 19, 20-year-old kid, the same one that was in Beirut, the same one that was at Abbey Gate, and they're standing at a checkpoint right now, and they're watching that truck approach, and they have that rifle in their hands, and it's off safe, fingers on the trigger, and they're that final decision maker. So just wanted to let's just keep them in our thoughts and prayers, and thank you guys for being here.
A great way to end this. So yes, thank you. And let's go to the museum store, shall we? So come on up.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as our special guests and parties exit the building.